And if you were here yesterday, you'll recognize this picture. I think Meredith used it in their presentation yesterday. So the first step of the research process is determining your research questions. What are you really looking to get out of this research? And there are two main avenues that I see here. So there's the architectural history and there's the social history. So the architectural history gets at the building itself, how it's physically evolved over time, what materials were used to build it, different construction techniques, things like that that are really the physical building itself. And social history is more of the people, the social aspect of it. So who lived in the building? What were their lives like? Was it a business or a workshop? How is it designed or decorated? Did it have an importance in the community? So those are kind of the two different halves that I'm seeing when I look at how to research a building. So I have some sample research questions. Depending on what you want to get out of your research, you're going to want to be looking at different sources. So for example, the first question there, what businesses operated in the building over the years, were specific goods produced or processed in the building? For a question like that, you're going to want to look at sources like city directories, Sanborn maps, local histories, photos. So it's kind of going to depend based on what you want to focus on. Focusing on that specific aspect of the history is going to help you narrow down your sources. There's a lot of sources out there and a lot of different aspects of a building's history. So you want to kind of focus before you even get started. So the process, now we're going to get into the actual process of doing research. Taking notes. This is one of the most important parts of doing research. You don't want to be in a situation where you have the perfect piece of information, but you can't remember where the heck you found it. So keep track of your sources. Even if you have a source that ended up not being useful, you want to make a note that you've looked at it so you don't duplicate your efforts later. You don't want to look at a book, decide it's not useful, and then forget, and 2 weeks later look at the same book all over again and duplicate your efforts. So citations are going to be really important if you choose to publish some of your findings, if you need it for National Register nomination, or if you're doing something like putting together an exhibit or a brochure. And in most cases, it doesn't really matter what citation style you choose, but for a lot of citations, they're going to need a lot of the same information. Author's name, the title of the source, the article or the page or the chapter or the collection or the box that it was found in, what date it was published, and the location, whether it was, in a physical library, in a book, or maybe you found it online. And the way to take notes is really what works best for you. You can utilize outlines and bullet points, which is what I prefer to use. You can do note cards, you could do photos, really whatever works best. And if you are going to take direct quotes from materials, make sure you're putting it in quotations and noting where it came from. You don't want to accidentally plagiarize later if you forget that you've written down a direct quote. Many of the resources we're going to go over today are going to be available online, which is great if you can't travel to the various repositories around the state. The resources that I'm going to touch on are all free today, but some are available with a membership like Ancestry or Fold3, and often those are accessible through your local library, which I'll mention later. A caveat with this, just remember, not everything is online as much as we wish it was. If you are doing all of your research online, you might miss out on some useful information. So just keep that in mind. And if you are going to a repository in person, these would be archives, libraries, historical societies. Before you even go, prepare as much as you can beforehand. So that means checking the website, connecting with staff beforehand, making a list of items you want to review while you're there. So that would be making a note of the titles and the call numbers for books, collection numbers if you're looking at an archival collection, titles and dates of maps, whatever information you can find on their website of materials that you want to see while you're there. And not all repositories are going to have detailed information online. Some of the bigger ones do, like the State Archives and the History Center at WVU. But smaller local historical societies may not have detailed information online. So ask a staff person. Do as much homework as you can beforehand so that you're prepared as you can be. But staffers at the organizations are going to know where to find other relevant resources that might be useful for your research question. They know the collection a lot better than you do. They're there day in and day out and can help point you in the right direction. So the sources. We have determined what aspect of the building's history we want to research, and we've prepared to conduct that research, whether we're looking online or in person. So now we're going to go over some sources that I found useful for research here in West Virginia. There's a lot, so I'm going to go through them pretty quickly, but we will have time for questions at the end. Claire, I think, also can send a handout with links to the digital resources. I believe we put that together for a previous presentation, so we can share that as well. So a great first place to start is our office's GIS map. This is free online, and it contains scanned records from our files. So on the map are various colored pins for different resources. So we have National Register sites in purple, National Register sites that have been demolished in a dark gray, architectural sites blue, architectural sites that have been demolished are light gray, and then cemeteries are green. And the pins in gray that mark demolished properties, those are fairly new within the last year. We've changed the color of those pins. And it can be a little depressing sometimes, but we have lost a lot of historic resources in the state. So having those resources that have been demolished in a different color visually shows where demolitions have taken place. So in some cases, particularly in Huntington, Wheeling, Charleston, you can see where entire residential blocks have been demolished for, big projects or the interstate or something like that. So that's a change that we've made fairly recently. So as I mentioned, all of the architectural sites are blue pins. Those link to our state level documentation, which we call the Historic Property Inventory Form. And the HPIs contain basic information about the property. And they date from the 1970s to the present. I think the earliest HPIs I've seen are kind of mid 70s. We'll see in the next slide. And we are adding more every single month. We do a monthly update to the map where we add additional sites to the map. So keep checking back. We're adding new information as we can. And some sites often will have multiple HPIs, which will reflect changes over time. So the example I have here is a property here in Charleston. You can see down at the bottom under reports, there is a 1 and a 2. That means we have 2 HPIs on file for this property. And in that sidebar, we are working to increase our data set, make it a little bit better so that properties will display the information we see here, such as the date of construction, the architect, the builder, the historic use, the architectural style. Not all of the pins on the map will have all of those fields filled out, and they might just be a lot of null, but we're working on updating that as we can moving forward. So we're going to go ahead and click those 2 links to the 2 HPIs for this property. And on the left, you can see an HPI from 1975-76. They did a survey here in Charleston. And then on the right is an HPI for the same residence in 2018. So we have documentation from two different surveys for the same property. And we can kind of compare the 2 to see how much has changed over the intervening years. And this one in particular, actually, not much has changed. There have been a little bit of window replacements, was really the only thing I could see when I compared these 2. Everything else is largely the same aside from, bushes and things growing up in the years. So sometimes it's a little bit more depressing. There have been, major alterations or demolitions, but in this case, it kind of shows that not much has changed. Even the entryway and that awning there looked to be original. So I will mention a caveat for the GIS map. We don't have survey reports for all of the buildings in the state. I wish we did. That would be great. But we get these in from survey projects and from members of the public. So we add information as we can. I don't know if we'll ever have all of the buildings in the state, but we're doing what we can. So if you see a building on the map that doesn't have an HPI on file, you are welcome to fill one out and send one in to us, and we can chat about that later if you all have any questions. So some of the other resources, city directories and phone books. Turn my notes over. City directories are going to tell you who lived at a certain address at a specific point in time. So often they're going to include profession as well as information about whether the person owns or rents the home. These are typically available in person at a variety of libraries and archives, and there are also a few available on archive.org, maybe like 2 or 3. There's not a whole lot available online, unfortunately. These really enable you to put together a timeline of who lived in the home or what businesses occupied the building over time. And one interesting example here is the Hatfield JL Lawyer at 174 Chancery Row. if you're familiar with Morgantown, you know that Chancery Row is right next to the courthouse, so it kind of makes sense that he had a residence or an office there right next to the courthouse. So these are really useful to kind of, like I said, track who was in the building over time. So this is a little bit more the social aspect of things. Sanborn maps. These are one of my favorite resources to browse. They're really nice visual resources. I'll show you in the next slide. They were intended for insurance purposes, fire insurance specifically. So they show the building materials, the number of floors, the type of roof, the type of siding, and the presence of fire alarms. So they're really concerned about, what is the building going to catch on fire? How far away is it from a hydrant? Things like that. And these are available online through the Library of Congress. They don't have all of the ones from the state of West Virginia, but they do have a pretty good collection available there. I believe there's also some available here at the State Archive, as well as at the West Virginia Regional History Center at WVU. Sanborn maps are really useful resources, but they're only going to be useful if you're researching a building in a town. They did not survey rural areas. They really only focused on population centers near to fire departments. So I have an example here. This is the Kanawha County Courthouse here in Charleston. The map on the left is the Sanborn map from 1893, and the one on the right is from 1902. And comparing those 2 years, we can see that there are multiple differences of things that have changed in the 9 years between those two maps. There have been some additions, there's some new construction, there's a couple of demolished buildings. So comparing these, you can kind of get a sense of the buildings and how they're physically changing over time. Specifically for the courthouse, we can see that in the 1902 map, they added on a little walkway, and it looks like a little side shed of some sort. So you can kind of see what year things are changing. Property records and other legal documents. These are a great resource as well. Useful legal documents include deeds, tax records, building permits, and wills. And I like to start my search with the West Virginia Property Viewer. This is the screenshot I have here. And we're going to walk through researching the deed for this particular property, which was a rental in Morgantown that I lived in 2018. So we are going to click the link for the parcel assessment report, and that will take you to this assessment data page. It's going to list the current owner of the property, the mailing address of the owner, the 911 address of the property, so the physical address, the parcel information, and then the book and page that the deed is recorded on. And that book and page information is specifically what we're interested in if we're wanting to trace the deed research. So once you have a book and page number, you'll want to Google Monongalia County Deed Search or Kanawha County Deed Search, whatever county you are researching. So not all counties in the state have this information online. You may have to go to the courthouse in person. But I have found that of the counties that do have this information online, it's through a portal that looks very similar to this one. So you're going to plug in the book and page number from the previous step, which I've done here, and select the record you're looking for. So we clicked image, and that will take us to a scan of the deed and the real estate description. The deed will include additional book and page numbers, which you'll want to make note of. So we can see 2 in this example, deed book 19, page 389, and then deed book 1113, page 613. So we'll make a note of that, and you can continue to plug those numbers into the deed search database and keep following that trail. This particular example took me all the way back to 1894 and the original description of the lot. So the screenshot I have there at the top, the handwritten document, that is the same document here, the deed description that I have. That's what I found from 1894. And as a bonus, this lot was also depicted on a map that I'll mention later on. So that was kind of neat to be able to see the lot description and then also see it visually on the map. Photographs. If you can find photos of your building, they are a great resource for documenting changes over time. There are some online repositories for the state, but many smaller organizations like local historical societies, things like that, may not have digitized photos, so you may need to visit in person. The West Virginia History On View through the West Virginia Regional History Center at WVU Libraries is a really great resource. All of the pictures, unless otherwise noted, are from that database. And then the State Archive here also has a decent photo database as well. And most of the time, you're not going to be able to find photos of a specific building. You can't just plug in the address and find a photo of the building. You're often going to want to kind of search around the building. So for this example, searching with the street name is usually a good way to go. We'll use Morgantown, for example. If you plug in High Street, your building's on High Street, you plug in High Street, you might get a view of a whole block, but maybe your building is, in the corner, and you can get a little bit of a picture there. And maybe you can see the rear of the building in a different picture. So you're going to kind of want to piece together information that way. And I have Woodburn Hall as an example of how buildings will change and expand over time. This one's a little bit dramatic. It's got 2 large wings added on. But buildings do evolve, and if you can find photo documentation, it's a really good resource to really get a picture of what the building looks like. Newspapers. So there are 2 main repositories of digitized newspapers for West Virginia. Chronicling America through the Library of Congress. That is where WVU libraries, their archive, when they are digitizing newspapers, that is where those end up. I had to update this because both of these portals have added new titles. So for Chronicling America, there are now 107 titles from West Virginia available online, and newspapers date from 1791 to 1941. And then the Potomac State newspaper portal, they have 54 titles currently available from 1837 to 1959. So that's a little bit later than what's on Chronicling America. Potomac State newspaper portal, I believe, is more of the, should have looked at a map before I did this, I believe it's more of the eastern portion of the state. So when you're looking at newspapers for this sort of research, you want to try the street name, the business name, maybe the name of the person who owned the building or owned the business. And some examples of information that you might find that would be useful could be maybe there was a business in the building and maybe they had an advertisement celebrating a new location that they opened. Or maybe on the social page, there's a notice that Mr. and Mrs. Hill purchased a house on Beach Avenue. Or there might be, as in the example I have here, an advertisement of a house for sale. So for this one, the top one there, a pretty corner lot with a modern 5-room cottage. It was $3,000. I did the math, and that's it's about $88,000 to $90,000. So I wish I could go back in time and buy that house. The local library is often an underused resource. Most libraries will have a local history or genealogy section, and some even have a dedicated space for local history, like the McClintock Heritage Room at the Pocahontas County Public Library, where I personally found a really excellent piece of information when I was in grad school that I couldn't find anywhere else. And libraries, as I mentioned earlier, will often have access to online databases like Ancestry.com or Fold3, which is more of a military-focused database. They may also have access to newspaper databases like newspapers.com, as well as they may have local newspapers available on file, probably on microfilm. If you are in the newspapers I mentioned earlier, they do have some available online, but not all of the newspapers in the state are going to be online. So you may need to go to the local library and trudge through some microfilm, which can be tedious, but it can be a good source of information. So in addition to the Sanborn maps at the Library of Congress, they also have other West Virginia maps, and these often will be more useful for rural areas. I know I have an example of Charleston here, but often these sorts of maps will depict the landowners of the property, different companies, schools, churches, things like that. So that's always a good place to check. And they can, on the Library of Congress, you can search their map collection specifically by state, and it will give you everything that covers the state. So it's a pretty easy search tool to use. The David Rumsey map collection. From what I can tell when I was putting this PowerPoint together last year, David Rumsey is just a guy who likes maps. And he just has this website where he hosts digitized maps from his collection. And one of my favorite map books is in this collection. The one I have here, it's an Atlas of Marion and Monongalia counties. You can see the beginnings of Woodburn Circle there in that green area. And one really great tool that this site in particular has is a georeferencing tool. which allows you to overlay a historical map with like a modern like Google map. So you can kind of get a sense of where things were in relation to what we're actually seeing on the streets today. So while maps don't typically show structures, aerial photographs will. This site that I'm sharing here is one that I've used previously. They typically have aerial maps from the 1950s to the present. It will vary based on what area you're looking at. Not all of the state will have a map from 1955. It may be a different year. I'm not sure where they get the source material from for this, but it's been a useful tool in my research. And this can help you pinpoint a date of construction or additions. So you're looking at the aerial view, you can't really see much details from the facade of the building or anything like that, but you can see the footprint itself. So the example I have here is the Capitol complex here in Charleston. You can see the Capitol there kind of at the center right, and that is from 1955. And then this image is from 1986. And so you can really see how the construction of the Culture Center demolished entire blocks here at the east end of Charleston. So the aerial photos, this is a pretty dramatic example, but can really show how either the specific building or the makeup of the neighborhood has changed over time. And my last recommendation is to talk to people. Neighbors and other local residents might have personal stories about the building, personal stories about the neighborhood. They may know somebody that, worked on the building when they did a renovation, things like that. There are local history Facebook pages where people share more recent photos. There's a group here in Charleston online on Facebook called Charleston, West Virginia Memories, and they, people on that site share all sorts of photos and other information. This is definitely a good starting point, but be sure to take it with a grain of salt. This is people's personal memories, and sometimes memories can, idealize certain things or whatever. So you'll want to use this as a starting point. So if someone says, oh, I remember, this store opened in this year, you can then go to the newspaper and kind of verify it with another source. And I know I've mentioned it a couple of times, but local historical societies don't often have a great online presence, but can have some really fantastic materials in person in their collections. And that is all I have for you. It may seem like a really big undertaking, but by breaking down your research and going one step at a time, you can bring together all these little bits of information to put together a bigger picture of the building's history. So I think we're at question time. We have time for questions, I think, and if you guys have any questions after the session, I do have my email address here as well. I'm happy to chat via email as well. We'll turn this off and put my camera back on.
Jess, if you wouldn't mind just kind of talking more about HPI forms and how our commission members can kind of help update those and things like that, because I think that's just a great thing to be doing. It helps us, helps the community, helps update the record. It's obviously it's free to do, and it just takes some time, so it's always helpful for us.
I think you kind of covered it there.
Okay, sorry.
Well, our office is mandated by law to survey and document properties in the state. So some of that we have you all to assist us with. The historic property inventory form is our state level documentation. Every state is going to have a different documentation form. We call ours the historic property inventory form. It's pretty short. It's 2 pages with an additional 3rd page that you can add additional text or photos on. And like I said, we often get those in from big surveys. We often have projects that are required to survey historic properties. We will commission surveys, and then we also just get them in from members of the public. So we would love to get them in from you all to update documentation. I think all of the CLGs have historic districts in their vicinity. A lot of them sometimes were done in the 80s, and maybe the documentation isn't as good as we would like, and things have changed since then, new pictures and things like that. So we're happy to work with you to kind of work on getting that documentation available. The GIS map that I shared towards the beginning, we do scan everything, make it available online. So anytime somebody is doing research on a property, we're making that information available and accessible to them.